all about Donald Trump's second inauguration, as the 60th U.S. president. But the thing is, it's not your typical inauguration day. You know what I mean? Picture this for a second. 8,000 National Guard troops are deployed.
Yeah.
All throughout Washington, D.C. And it's not for like a natural disaster or anything like that. It's just for the inauguration.
Yeah, what's really striking to me is that, this time around we're seeing way fewer protesters.
Yeah.
Especially compared to Trump's first inauguration back in 2017. It really makes you wonder what's changed over the last 4 years and what this inauguration could tell us about where American politics are going.
Okay, so let's unpack this a little bit. First off, we've got this massive security presence, 8,000 National Guard troops, and they're from 40 different states. One article even describes them setting up a perimeter around the National Gallery of Art. I mean, that's not exactly the kind of image you usually associate with like a peaceful transfer of power, right?
Right? It definitely creates this kind of sense of unease, and it makes you ask, what prompted this massive security measure? Some of the articles point to protests, but they also emphasize that these protests are much smaller than the ones we saw in 2017. It's interesting, though. A lot of the protests that are happening are focused on women's rights and racial justice.
So if the protests are smaller, why the huge show of force? I mean, is it a matter of just over-preparing? Or is there something else going on here? Could it be that the authorities are just more concerned about potential violence or disruption this time?
That's a good question. It's hard to say for sure, without being privy to the intelligence they're working with. But it is worth thinking about how the events of the past 4 years, including, the rise of more extreme political ideologies, might be factoring into these security decisions.
Yeah, speaking of changes over the last 4 years, the articles mention this idea of progressive voter exhaustion. It's basically this idea that some progressive voters are feeling kind of disillusioned, especially after Kamala Harris lost to Trump in the election. Do you think that could be contributing to the smaller protest turnout?
It's certainly possible. Some people might just feel like their vote doesn't even matter, or that the system is rigged against them. And let's be honest, the past few years have been pretty politically tumultuous. It wouldn't be surprising if some people are just feeling burnt out.
Yeah, it makes you think about how this perceived exhaustion might affect the political landscape moving forward. Like, if a significant portion of the population is feeling disillusioned, could that impact voter turnout in future elections? Could it even lead to more political apathy in general?
Yeah, those are important questions to consider. And it's not just about voter turnout either. It's also about the energy and resources that people are willing to put into activism and political organizing. If people are feeling exhausted, that could have a ripple effect on all sorts of political movements and initiatives.
Yeah, and the articles also mention a potential fracturing within the women's rights movement after the election. They suggested there might be disagreements about strategies and priorities moving forward. Now, I don't want to get too deep into the weeds here, but I am curious to hear your thoughts on this. What are some potential implications of this fracturing within the women's rights movement?
Well, one potential consequence is that it could make it harder for the movement to present a united front and to effectively advocate for its goals. Different factions within the movement might have different priorities. And if they're not able to work together, that could really weaken their overall impact.
That makes sense. And it kind of brings us back to this bigger question of how the political climate has shifted over the past 4 years and how that's being reflected in this somewhat unusual inauguration. So far, we've got heightened security, potentially smaller protests, and this idea of progressive voter exhaustion. What other interesting tidbits did you find in these articles?
Well, one thing that stood out to me was the decision to move the inauguration ceremony indoors because of the freezing temperatures. That's not something you see very often. Imagine being sworn in as president, not on those grand steps of the Capitol building, but inside. It definitely changes the feeling of the event, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. And speaking of unusual, there's also talk about Trump planning to sign a bunch of executive orders right after taking office. It seems like he's eager to just hit the ground running and enact his agenda right from day one. What do you make of this? Is this a sign of things to come?
It could be. Executive orders allow presidents to bypass Congress and enact policies unilaterally. So this move might indicate that Trump intends to govern in a more assertive way, maybe even a more confrontational way this time around. It definitely raises questions about how he'll interact with Congress and whether we can expect more gridlock and political battles in the coming years.
That's a great point. We've already seen some tension between Trump and Congress during his first term, so it'll be interesting to see how that dynamic evolves now that he's back in office. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Before we dive into speculation about the future, I want to make sure we've covered all the bases. Regarding the inauguration itself, anything else about the event itself that struck you as significant?
Well, it's interesting to think about, you know, the juxtaposition of this heavily fortified capital with smaller protests and a president who seems eager to push his agenda through executive orders. I think it paints a pretty complex picture of where we are politically.
Yeah, you're right. It's definitely not a simple situation. It's almost like there's this underlying tension, but it's not manifesting in the same way it did 4 years ago.
Exactly. And that's where things get really interesting. We have to ask ourselves, what does this tell us about the current political climate? Is this a sign of simmering resentment that's kind of bubbling under the surface? Or is it maybe a reflection of a shift in how people are choosing to engage politically?
Yeah, it's something to think about, for sure. While we're talking about executive orders, what kind of policies are we actually talking about here? The article doesn't get into specifics. It seems like Trump is ready to make some big moves right out of the gate.
From what I gathered, it sounds like he's planning to tackle immigration, energy and trade, among other things. It seems like he's going for those policies that will have an immediate and noticeable impact, maybe as a way to solidify his base and show that he's committed to fulfilling his campaign promises.
So what does that tell us about his governing style for the second term? Is this a sign that he's going to be even more assertive?
Yeah.
And less willing to compromise with Congress?
It's possible. Bypassing Congress through executive orders could become a more common tactic for him, especially if he faces a lot of resistance from lawmakers. It could be a sign of a shift toward a more unilateral approach to governing, which could have some big implications for the balance of power in Washington.
Yeah, it definitely raises concerns about potential overreach of executive power. And speaking of the bigger picture, how do you think these early moves fit into the broader context of the political landscape? We talked about the division and anxiety, but are there other factors at play here?
Absolutely. It's important to remember that we're not just dealing with the aftermath of this contentious election. We're also navigating the ongoing effects of a global pandemic, economic uncertainty, and a lot of social unrest. All of these factors contribute to this feeling of unease and volatility in our political climate.
And let's not forget about the role of social media in all of this. It feels like every single day there's a new controversy brewing online, and it's hard to know what information to actually trust anymore. It feels like social media has amplified the division and polarization we're seeing in society.
You're right. Social media has become a breeding ground for misinformation and echo chambers, where people are only exposed to viewpoints that confirm what they already believe. It makes it much harder to have productive conversations and find common ground.
It's like we're living in two completely different realities. It makes you wonder, how do we even move forward in a constructive way when there's such a lack of shared understanding?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? I think it starts with recognizing the challenges we're facing and being willing to engage in some of these more difficult conversations. We need to be critical of the information we're taking in, seek out diverse perspectives, and be open to challenging our own assumptions.
So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, what are some key takeaways for our listeners? What should they be paying attention to as this second Trump presidency unfolds?
I think the most important thing is to stay informed and engaged. Don't just rely on headlines or social media for your news. Dig deeper, consult reputable sources, and try to understand all the nuances of the issues.
And beyond staying informed, what else can our listeners do to navigate these complex political waters? What kind of mindset or approach would you recommend?
I think it's crucial to really cultivate those critical thinking skills. Don't just accept information at face value. Question everything. Consider different perspectives and form your own informed conclusions.
Sounds like you're saying we should all be a lot more discerning and thoughtful about how we approach information these days, especially with everything being so politically charged.
Exactly. And it's not just about being critical of the information itself, but also about really understanding the context. What are the motivations of the people who are presenting this information? And what are the potential biases that might be at play?
So to kind of wrap up our deep dive here, what are some key takeaways you want our listeners to remember about this inauguration and what it might tell us about the future?
Well, I think one of the biggest takeaways is that we're looking at a nation grappling with some really deep divisions. These heightened security measures, they kind of point to all this underlying anxiety about the potential for unrest.
And yet the protests are smaller than they were during Trump's first inauguration. which maybe suggests a shift in public sentiment. I don't know, maybe a mix of exhaustion and resignation.
Yeah, and we can't forget about Trump's immediate focus on signing those executive orders. It seems like he's taking a really decisive approach to governing, and he's willing to bypass those traditional legislative processes if he feels it's necessary.
So as we move forward into the second Trump presidency, I think it's more important than ever to stay informed and engaged. And like you were saying, we need to be thinking critically about the information that we're consuming.
Exactly. We can't just accept the headlines at face value. We have to dig a little deeper, seek out different perspectives, and come to our own conclusions.
You know, thinking back to those images of the National Guard around the National Gallery of Art, it really sets the tone, doesn't it? It kind of makes you wonder what kind of legacy this second Trump presidency is going to leave behind.
Yeah, it's tough to say for sure. But one thing is clear. We're definitely in for a period of change. And there's a lot of uncertainty. The decisions that get made in the coming months and years are going to have a real lasting impact on the country, on the political landscape, the social landscape, and the economic landscape.
It really feels like we're at a crossroads. And each of us has to decide how we want to navigate this uncharted territory.
And that's a powerful thought to leave our listeners with. It's not just about watching what's happening. It's about being a part of it. It's about shaping the future.
Well said. This has been a fascinating deep dive. I feel like I have a much better grasp now on all the complexities surrounding this second Trump inauguration.
Like always, the most important part is what you, our listener, take away from this conversation. How do these events make you feel? What questions come to mind? What insights did you get?
We really encourage you to keep exploring these issues, find more information, and talk about it with other people.
Because at the end of the day, it's through informed and engaged citizenship that we can navigate these challenging times and work towards a more just and equitable society.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the inauguration of the 60th U.S. President, Donald Trump. We'll be back soon with another insightful exploration of a current event.
Until then, stay curious, stay informed, and keep asking those tough questions.